In 1529, an Ottoman army camped before the gates of Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg Empire, the heart of Christian Europe. They had marched 1,300 kilometers from Constantinople across the Balkan Mountains, across the rivers of Eastern Europe through summer and into autumn, crossing battlefields that had only just fallen silent to arrive here. And when they arrived, after a journey of nearly 5 months, they were not a broken mob of exhausted remnants. They were an intact war machine, still strong enough to besiege one of the most fortified cities in Europe. That army carried an estimated 120,000 to 300,000 people. The exact number remains a subject of debate because no European empire at that time had the ability to mobilize a comparable force. Took the entire population of England in the 16th century was only around 2.5 million people. The Ottomans brought to Vienna an army equal to 5 to 12% of the total population of a major island nation and moved them 1,300 kilometers while still maintaining discipline, logistics, and combat power. Today, we are not asking why the Ottomans were so powerful. Instead, we are raising the question, what machine created such a miracle? Because no sultan, no matter how brilliant, could personally coordinate 300,000 human beings across 1,300 kilometers of hostile terrain. No general, no matter how exceptional, could keep such a massive army fed, equipped, and fighting effectively after months of marching. That required something larger than any individual, a system. Today, we will dismantle the Ottoman war machine piece by piece. Not to glorify the empire, but to understand it. Because this was one of the most complex organizational constructions humanity ever built, and it operated for 6 centuries. Before talking about the solution, let's talk about the problem. Because every design is an answer to a specific question. The central question of every expanding empire is the question of scale and control. These two things are fundamentally in conflict with each other. When you conquer a new land, you need people to govern it. But people capable enough to govern are also capable enough to betray. People who have armies to defend territory also have armies to rebel. This is the problem every empire must solve. And most solve it badly. The most common solution in history was to rely on the local aristocracy. Grant land, grant titles, grant power to influential families in exchange for their loyalty. The problem is that this conditional loyalty usually lasts only until interests change. And interests always change. The Carolean Empire collapsed because its counts and lords became strong enough to become independent. The Mongol Empire fractured into 4 pieces within a single generation after Genghis Khan, because there was no stable mechanism of succession. The Chinese Empire under most dynasties had to fight constantly against local officials who accumulated enough power to challenge the center. The Ottomans understood this problem and they designed their war machine from its core to eliminate that dead point. Their solution did not begin with weapons, not with tactics, but with the question of human beings. How do you create warriors and officials whose entire existence is bound tightly to the empire? Not because of emotion, but because structurally they have no other choice. This is what made the Ottomans different from almost every empire in history. They did not merely recruit warriors. They produced warriors. The Devshirme system, the Ottoman human resources algorithm, was analyzed in detail in a previous script. But to understand the war machine, we need to look at what that system produced at the output. The Janissaries. The Janissaries were not soldiers in the ordinary sense. They were the product of a manufacturing process controlled tightly from beginning to end. That process began when they were still boys between 8 and 18 years old. Selected from Christian families in the Balkans, converted to Islam, and placed into a training system that lasted for many years. When they emerged from the other end of that system, they were no longer Bulgarians, Albanians, or Greeks. They were Ottomans, and not only culturally in terms of social structure, they had no family to protect, no land to dispute, no tribe to serve. The barracks were their home. The platoon was their family. The Sultan was the only father they acknowledged. This was the genius of the design. Loyalty was not based on moral commitment, but on the elimination of every alternative. A warrior with family back home, with a wife and children, with land. When the war drums sound at dawn, there is an inner battle in his mind. Fight to nor survive to return. The Janissary did not have that inner battle. Nothing waited for him outside the barracks. Fighting was the only existence he knew. At their 16th century peak, the number of Janissaries reached around 40,000 to 80,000 men, a salaried standing force, while most European armies were still seasonal militias returning home after the harvest. That meant that while European rivals had only a few months to assemble forces, the Ottomans could deploy elite troops at any time of the year. But this is what most people misunderstand about Ottoman military power. The Janissaries were not their secret weapon. The Janissaries were one module within a much larger architecture. So the Ottoman war machine operated on the principle of modularization, exactly like the Roman Empire with its cohort system. Each part was designed to operate independently or in coordination, and each part complemented the others. Look at the full architecture. Layer 1, Sepahi, the cavalry of the empire. The Sepahi were heavy cavalry recruited from free Turks not through Dev Shurm and granted land revenues Timar in exchange for military service. They were the mobile force of the empire capable of encirclement pursuit and breaking enemy formations. In the 16th century, the Ottomans could mobilize up to 100,000 Sepahi cavalry, a number unimaginable to any European rival. Layer 2, Janissaries. The elite infantry. They did not advance, retreat, or waver. They were the central processor of every battle. Deployed at the decisive moment after the Sepahi had exploited the opening. Layer 3, Azap and Akuna, supporting forces. The Azap were light infantry, often used in the first attacks to measure the enemy's defenses and wear down their forces. The Akin were light cavalry specialized in scouting and raiding. Men who rode ahead of the main army for weeks, gathering intelligence and spreading chaos behind enemy lines. Layer 4, Topçu, artillery. From the mid-15th century onward, the Ottomans invested heavily in artillery. And they did not invest only in weapons, but in the entire ecosystem surrounding those weapons: engineers, foundry workers, gunpowder specialists, and most importantly, a tactical doctrine for how to use artillery in coordination with infantry. Layer 5, Donanma, the navy. This is the least discussed module, but it had vital strategic importance, and we will return to it. What mattered was not the existence of each of these modules. What mattered was how they coordinated with one another. And behind that coordination was something medieval armies often completely lacked: a logistic system designed to feed the machine while it moved. There is a principle in war that many people outside the military do not understand correctly. Battles are not lost on the battlefield. They are lost in food depots and on supply roads. Napoleon understood this. Wellington understood this. And the Ottomans understood this 400 years before both of them. Let's return to the 300,000-man army advancing toward Vienna in 1529. A human being needs about 1 to 1.5 kilograms of food per day to maintain fighting capability. With 300,000 people, that is 300 to 450 tons of food per day. Over 5 months of marching, that army consumed an estimated 45,000 to 67,000 tons of food and fodder, not counting weapons, ammunition, tents, and engineering equipment. No trucks, no trains, no highways. Everything moved by horse, mule, and ox-drawn cart on the dirt roads of the 16th century. So, how did the Ottomans do it? The Menelhani system supply stations. Along the main marching routes, the Ottomans built a network of fixed supply stations, Menzelhana, spaced 1 day's ride apart, around 25 to 40 kilometers. Each station stored food, fodder, replacement horses, and military supplies. When the army arrived, the station provided what was needed, and the army continued without having to stop to search or gather supplies. This system meant that the Ottoman marching speed was not limited by the carrying capacity of their own logistics train. They were essentially moving through a supply pipeline that had already been established. The new Zul system controlled requisition. When marching through their own territory, the Ottoman army followed a legalized requisition system, Nuzul, which clearly regulated what the army had the right to take from local populations and at what price. This was not random plunder. This was managed war taxation, a difference that seemed small but had enormous consequences. An army that plunders causes people to flee, hide food, and sabotage. An army that requisitions under control causes people to stay, but sell what they have and keep the local economy functioning. Meaning that the next time the army returns along that route, there is still something to take. The Sursat system, mobile market. Following every major Ottoman army was a caravan of merchants licensed and controlled by the state, providing what the state system could not provide: clothing, tools, special food, and other goods that soldiers were willing to buy with their wages. The Ottoman army was not only a fighting force. It was a mobile economy. Combined, these three systems created a logistical capability that no army in Europe at the same time could match. This explains why the Ottomans, not once, not twice, but for many consecutive decades, could launch massive military campaigns into lands thousands of kilometers away. In 1453, something happened that changed every rule of war in Europe and the Middle East. Not because it was the first time anyone used cannons, but because it was the first time anyone used cannons correctly. Cannons had existed in Europe for more than a century before Constantinople fell. But in most armies, they were used as a psychological weapon or an auxiliary tool. Loud, impressive, but not central to tactical doctrine. Sultan Mehmed II and his military engineers did something different. They built an artillery tactical doctrine from the ground up. The Orban cannon, built by a Hungarian engineer named Orban on Ottoman commission, was not a miracle of technology. The gun was 8 m long, fired stone balls weighing more than half a ton. Shoe took 2 hours to reload and required 60 oxen and 200 men just to move it. In an open battle against a mobile enemy, it was almost useless. But Mehmed did not need it for an open battle. He needed it to do one specific thing: break the Theodosian walls. The triple-layered defensive structure that had protected Constantinople for 1,000 years. And here was the real design. Orban did not fire alone. It was deployed together with 14 other large cannons and around 56 to 62 smaller cannons, all arranged to concentrate fire on specific points of the wall. This is what today would be called battery tactics. Focused bombardment on one point until that point collapses, then shifting to the next point. The result: the Theodosian walls, designed to withstand every attacking technology of the 5th century, were broken in 53 days. Ada, a structure that had protected the city for 1,000 years, was not broken by human strength, but by an artillery doctrine designed to solve exactly that problem. But here is what is truly remarkable. After 1453, the Ottomans did not stop there. They continued investing in and refining their artillery capability, while many European rivals were still trying to copy what the Ottomans had done. By the 16th century, the Ottomans were perhaps the most sophisticated producers and users of artillery in the world. Not because they had better technology in theory, but because they had a system that integrated artillery into tactics, something most of their rivals did not yet have. In 1453, when the Golden Horn was locked shut by a massive iron chain and the Zantine navy controlled the entrance, the Ottomans faced a simple geometric problem. They could not get ships into attack position from the bay. Their solution was one of the boldest logistical actions in military history. They dragged ships over land. More specifically, in one night, 70 warships were placed on greased wooden rollers and dragged across a hill about 3 to 4 kilometers long down the other side into the Golden Horn. Each ship weighed dozens of tons. The work required thousands of men, hundreds of oxen, and an engineering plan calculated in detail beforehand. And all of it was done in darkness, shocking quietly enough that the Zantine defenders did not discover it until dawn broke. And they saw 70 Ottoman warships floating on waters that had been completely safe the day before. This was not spontaneous. This was a logistics operation planned in detail weeks in advance, requiring terrain surveys, load calculations, material preparation, labor coordination, and security protocols to keep the secret until the final minute. What mattered more than the event of 1453 was the principle behind it. The Ottomans saw geographic limits not as something unchangeable, but as a variable in a logistics problem. If nature does not give you a road, you create a road. If the bay is locked, you go around by land. This principle, override geography through logistical engineering, appeared many times in Ottoman military history. They built pontoon bridges across wide rivers to allow entire armies to cross in hours instead of days. They dug canals to move ships between seas. They built artillery roads before every major siege. Not dirt roads, but wooden planked roads capable of supporting the weight of giant cannons. If the Janissaries were the face of Ottoman power, then the Ottoman navy was its strategic brain. Less discussed, but impossible to ignore in importance. The Ottoman geographic problem was the problem of an empire stretched across 3 continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe, connected by the Mediterranean Sea, the Black Sea, and the Red Sea. Controlling these waters was not only a military issue. It was an issue of economic survival. In 1571 at the Battle of Lento, the Ottoman navy was defeated by the Christian coalition under the leadership of Don Juan of Austria. More than 200 Ottoman warships were sunk or captured. Tens of thousands died. Europeans celebrated as though the Ottoman Empire had collapsed. 1 year later, the Ottomans rebuilt the entire navy from scratch. Within 12 months, the Ottomans built and equipped 250 new warships, nearly equal to the entire force that had just been destroyed. This was what the Spanish writer and statesman Cervantes, who fought at Lepanto and was wounded there later, described with awe. The Ottomans did not merely have ships. They had a shipbuilding system. That system was centered at the Tersain Emir shipyard in Constantinople, one of the largest industrial zones in the medieval world. At its peak, when this shipyard could build 30 to 50 warships per year, a production speed no European naval power could sustain in peacetime, let alone after just losing nearly its entire fleet. Lepanto did not defeat the Ottoman navy. It only showed that the Ottoman navy could be defeated faster than their rebuilding system could compensate. When the attack stopped, the system compensated and recovered. You cannot understand the Ottoman war machine without talking about a component that is often overlooked: the intelligence and information system. The Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents and came into contact with dozens of different cultures, languages, and political institutions. To govern and fight effectively in that environment required real-time information about what was happening on the borders, inside enemy territory, and internally. The Ottomans met this need through several mechanisms: merchant and diplomatic networks. The Ottomans maintained diplomatic and commercial relations with most major powers of the world, not only for economic benefit, but because merchant networks were the best intelligence channels that existed before the 20th century. A Venetian merchant trading in Constantinople, while his colleague at the Habsburg court provided information to both sides. The Ottomans knew this and exploited it. The messenger and communication system. The Menselhani network we discussed in the logistics section also served as a communication system. Each station maintained replacement horses not only for armies, but for special couriers. Important information from the border could reach Constantinople in significantly less time than by ordinary routes using minority populations. This is the most sophisticated aspect. In newly conquered provinces, especially in the Balkans, the Ottomans often allowed Christian and Jewish communities to maintain their internal organizations as long as they paid taxes and did not rebel. In return, these communities often provided information about the movements of Western powers because they had communication networks with co-religious communities in Europe that the Ottomans could not directly access. This is the point where most military stories usually stop. Victory, occupation, end. But the Ottomans understood that military victory was the easiest step. The real challenge was, how do you turn the land you just conquered into something that can sustain and regenerate resources for the empire instead of merely consuming them? The Ottomans had a system to answer that question, and it differed significantly from most empires of the same period: the millet system. Instead of trying to assimilate the entire conquered population, something Rome had done, eventually creating the consequence that Roman identity became diluted to the point of losing cohesion. The Ottomans did the opposite. They allowed different communities to maintain their own identities as long as they acknowledged the supreme authority of the Sultan. Orthodox Christians had their own millet led by the Patriarch of the Church. But Armenian Christians had their own millet. Jews had their own millet. Each community managed its own internal issues: marriage, inheritance, religious disputes according to its own laws as long as it paid taxes and did not violate the authority of the Ottoman state. This was a brilliant administrative design decision. Instead of spending resources to force assimilation, something that never fully succeeds and always creates resistance, the Ottomans gave minority communities a reason to voluntarily maintain stability. The leader of a millet had an interest in keeping his community compliant because his own status and power depended on that relationship. The Timar system. To solve the problem of local territorial management, who controls the land, who collects taxes, who maintains order, the Ottomans used the Timar system, granting land use rights, not land ownership, to Sipahi warriors in exchange for military and administrative duties. The important difference: Timar was the right to use land, not ownership of land. When a Sipahi died, the Timar did not automatically pass to his son. It could be reclaimed and redistributed by the state. This meant that noble family could accumulate land over generations to the point of becoming strong enough to challenge the center. This was the complete opposite design of European feudalism, where land was inherited and local power accumulated across generations until local lords became real counterweights to the king. Every system has a point of failure, and the Ottoman war machine was no exception. But what is interesting is this. The Ottoman war machine was not defeated by a better enemy. It was sabotaged by its own successes. The story begins with the Janissaries. In the first centuries, Janissaries were not allowed to marry, not allowed to conduct business, and their sons were not allowed to join the Janissaries. These restrictions, though they may seem harsh, were the core principle that created their absolute loyalty. When there is nothing outside the machine, you protect the machine at all costs. But the Janissaries became increasingly powerful, and power creates bargaining leverage. Gradually over generations, these restrictions were loosened. Janissaries were allowed to marry. Their sons were allowed to register for entry, completely bypassing the devsherami system. Due to the number of Janissaries soared, not because the empire needed more warriors, but because this had become a well-paid job you could pass on to your children. In 1527, there were around 12,000 Janissaries. In 1650, that number rose to 51,000. By 1800, an estimated 100,000 to 200,000 people carried the title of Janissary, but most of them had never seen a real battle. The most elite fighting force in the world had turned into a political interest group. They deposed sultans. They assassinated grand viziers. They refused to carry out modernizing military reforms because reform would threaten their privileges. When the Ottoman Empire tried to adopt modern European tactics and weapons in the late 18th century, the Janissaries resisted and rebelled. In 1826, Sultan Mahmud II decided to solve the problem decisively, and he ordered the dissolution of the Janissaries and the creation of a new modern army. The Janissaries rebelled exactly as he predicted, and he had prepared for it. Loyal artillery was positioned around the Janissary barracks in Constantinople. That night they fired cannons directly into the barracks. An estimated 4,000 to 7,000 Janissaries were killed. Thousands more were executed in the following weeks. The event was called Vakari here, the auspicious incident. The force that had protected the Ottomans for 500 years was wiped out in one night by the very empire it served. But it was too late. Not because the Janissaries were destroyed. That was the right decision. It was too late because during the 200 years of their degeneration, so the Ottoman war machine had lost the rhythm of continuous modernization that European rivals France, Prussia, Russia had maintained. European military technology and tactics had advanced so far that the gap could no longer be closed simply by eliminating a reactionary force. The Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1922. Its war machine stopped operating. But the design principles behind that machine remain sharp lessons for anyone who wants to understand how power is organized at large scale. Principle 1. Systems are stronger than individuals. The Ottomans did not depend on a genius sultan or an exceptional general. They built training, logistics, and governance systems that could function effectively even when the people running them were average. An organization that depends on genius is fragile. An organization designed to operate with ordinary people is sustainable. Principle 2. Loyalty is created by structure, not emotion. The Ottomans did not rely on voluntary loyalty or patriotism, things that are unstable and unpredictable. They created structures in which betraying the empire was less advantageous in terms of self-interest than serving it. This is the principle every large organization from armies to corporations still uses today. Principle 3. Logistics is strategy. What created Ottoman military power was not only their warriors, but their ability to bring those warriors to the right place at the right time with enough equipment to fight. Every sophisticated strategy becomes meaningless if logistics cannot support it. Principle 4. Modularization creates resilience. Not the Ottoman war machine did not collapse when one module broke because other modules still operated. When the Janissaries degenerated, the artillery remained strong. When the navy was defeated at Lento, it was rebuilt. Only when many modules began to fail at the same time, the Janissaries degenerating, logistics weakening because of financial crisis, the navy becoming technologically outdated, did the entire system begin to lose control? Principle 5. Short-term success can destroy long-term design. The degeneration of the Janissaries was not failure. It was excessive success. They became too powerful, too indispensable to the point that the empire could not reform them without facing rebellion. And this is the trap every organization must avoid. When one component becomes strong enough to obstruct the change the organization needs in order to survive. 623 years, 3 continents, dozens of succession crises, hundreds of wars, and countless enemies who declared that the Ottomans were about to collapse and were wrong. The Ottoman war machine was not great because it could not be defeated. It was great because it was designed to learn from defeat, rebuild after losses, and adapt to changing conditions. For so long that no other empire in Eurasian history could match it. And that machine was not built in one day. Not by one genius, not from a single technological discovery. It was built piece by piece across generations, by people who saw specific problems and designed specific solutions, then integrated those solutions into a larger system. That is how great machines are built. Not through inspiration, through engineering. And the trade routes they control, the legal institutions they built, and the organizational principles they pioneered all still leave their mark on today's world, whether we recognize it or not. Thank you for listening. Please like and share to see more fascinating stories.